The red light blinked mercilessly on the simulation console as Captain Sarah Mitchell watched another promising cadet crash and burn in the virtual cockpit. It was the 14th failure that month at Randolph Air Force Base's elite flight training program, and the pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. When it came to emergency procedures in large military transport aircraft, even the most talented pilots struggled to maintain control when everything went wrong at once. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The C-130 Hercules simulator wasn't just any training device. It was a million-dollar piece of equipment designed to replicate every possible nightmare scenario a pilot might face in real combat situations. Engine failures, hydraulic system breakdowns, electrical fires, severe weather conditions, and structural damage, all compressed into 30 minutes of pure terror that would either forge a pilot's confidence or shatter their dreams entirely. What made these simulations particularly brutal wasn't just their complexity, but their unforgiving nature. In the real world, pilots rarely faced multiple catastrophic failures simultaneously. But military transport pilots needed to be prepared for the absolute worst-case scenarios, especially when carrying precious cargo. Whether that cargo was critical supplies for troops in hostile territory, or, more importantly, human lives. The statistics were sobering. Out of every 100 cadets who entered the advanced C-130 training program, only 12 would graduate with full certification to pilot the massive 4-engine turboprop in combat situations. The rest would be reassigned to smaller aircraft, ground support roles, or in some cases, washed out of the aviation program entirely. Flight training had always been an exclusive club, but C-130 certification represented the pinnacle of military transport aviation. These aircraft weren't just planes. They were flying lifelines capable of carrying up to 128 troops or 42,000 pounds of cargo into some of the most dangerous airspace on Earth. From dropping paratroopers behind enemy lines to evacuating wounded soldiers from forward operating bases, C-130 pilots held the lives of countless military personnel in their hands every time they took to the skies. The physical demands alone were staggering. A fully loaded C-130 weighed over 155,000 pounds and required precise coordination between all 4 crew members to operate safely. The pilot needed to master not just basic flight controls, but complex cargo loading calculations, aerial refueling procedures, low-altitude navigation in hostile environments, and emergency landing techniques on improvised airstrips that would make civilian pilots break out in cold sweats. But the psychological pressure was even more intense. Military transport pilots operated in a world where failure meant more than just a poor grade or a reprimand from an instructor. In combat zones, a single mistake could result in the loss of dozens of lives, the failure of critical missions, and potentially the compromise of entire military operations. This pressure was precisely what made the simulator program so ruthless. Instructors didn't just test cadets' technical skills, they pushed them to their absolute breaking point to see who would crack under pressure and who would find a way to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. The scenarios were designed by military psychologists and veteran pilots who had survived real emergencies in combat zones. They drew from decades of actual incidents, near misses, and tragic accidents to create training situations that were not just realistic, but often more challenging than anything pilots would face in actual service. The philosophy was simple. If you could handle the simulator's worst-case scenarios, you could handle anything the real world threw at you. Engine failure scenarios started simple, single engine out during takeoff or landing. But they quickly escalated to multiple engine failures, often combined with other system malfunctions. Hydraulic system failures meant losing control of landing gear, flaps, and steering. Electrical fires required immediate emergency procedures while maintaining aircraft control. Weather scenarios included severe turbulence, icing conditions, and zero-visibility approaches to airfields under enemy fire. This shortage created pressure from multiple directions. Military leadership needed qualified pilots immediately, which tempted some to lower standards or rush training schedules. But the unforgiving nature of military aviation meant that inadequately trained pilots posed risks not just to themselves, but to everyone who would depend on their skills in life-or-death situations. The simulation program existed at this tension point between urgent need and uncompromising safety standards. Instructors couldn't afford to graduate pilots who weren't truly ready for the challenges they would face, regardless of how desperately those pilots were needed in operational units. Training aircraft themselves represented massive investments of taxpayer money. A single C-130 cost tens of millions of dollars, and losing one due to pilot error would not only waste resources, but potentially cost lives. The simulator program was designed to ensure that such losses were extremely rare, but this meant accepting high failure rates during training. For cadets entering this environment, the challenge was both immediate and long-term. They needed to master incredibly complex systems and procedures, while proving they possessed the psychological resilience to handle extreme stress. They had to demonstrate technical competence while showing the judgment and leadership qualities necessary for military command responsibilities. The simulator represented the ultimate test of these qualities. It stripped away all external factors and focused purely on a pilot's ability to think clearly, act decisively, and maintain control when everything was falling apart around them. Success in the simulator didn't guarantee success in real-world operations, but failure almost certainly predicted struggles when facing actual emergencies. This was the world that awaited every cadet who dreamed of flying military transport aircraft, a world where excellence was the minimum acceptable standard, where lives depended on split-second decisions, and where the difference between success and failure could be measured in milliseconds of reaction time or degrees of aircraft attitude. It was into this unforgiving environment that Cadet Jessica Reynolds stepped when she first entered the Advanced Flight Training Program at Randolph Air Force Base. Armed with excellent grades from initial flight training, strong recommendations from her instructors, and an unwavering determination to prove herself worthy of flying the military's most critical missions, she was about to discover that all her preparation had barely scratched the surface of the challenges that lay ahead. Jessica Reynolds had grown up surrounded by aviation. Her father, Master Sergeant Robert Reynolds, had spent 22 years maintaining C-130 engines at various Air Force bases around the world. Her earliest memories were of family quarters near flight lines, where the distinctive sound of turboprop engines spooling up for takeoff served as a constant soundtrack to her childhood. Unlike many military families who moved frequently, the Reynolds family had been fortunate to spend Jessica's formative years at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where her father worked on the aircraft that supported critical humanitarian and combat missions across Europe and the Middle East. Jessica had watched countless C-130s lumber down runways carrying everything from medical supplies to special operations teams, never imagining that she would one day sit in their cockpits. Her path to aviation had been anything but traditional. While most future pilots dreamed of flying from early childhood, Jessica initially planned to follow her mother's footsteps into nursing. She excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and physics, but viewed these subjects as stepping stones to a medical career rather than preparation for flight training. The turning point came during her sophomore year at the University of Colorado, where she was studying pre-med. A mandatory ROTC physical fitness test had gone poorly, not because she lacked athleticism, but because a severe case of pneumonia had left her struggling with reduced lung capacity for months. Faced with the possibility of medical disqualification from her nursing program, Jessica found herself exploring alternative career paths within the military structure that had defined her family's life. An Air Force recruiter, Captain Martinez, noticed her exceptional aptitude test scores and suggested she consider the aviation program. Jessica's initial reaction was skeptical. She had never considered herself pilot material, associating aviation with the kind of aggressive, risk-taking personality types she had observed among the young officers who visited her father's maintenance hangars. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Captain Martinez painted a different picture of military aviation, particularly transport flying. He described pilots who were essentially flying truck drivers, responsible for moving critical cargo and personnel safely from point A to point B. It required precision, careful planning, and systematic thinking, qualities that Jessica possessed in abundance, even if she had never applied them to aviation. What truly captured Jessica's imagination was learning about the humanitarian missions. C-130s regularly flew disaster relief operations, medical evacuations from remote locations, and supply runs to areas where commercial aviation couldn't operate safely. These missions combined the technical challenge of flying complex aircraft with the satisfaction of directly saving lives, exactly the kind of meaningful work that had originally attracted her to nursing. The decision to switch career tracks wasn't easy. Jessica's academic performance in pre-med had been stellar, and her professors were disappointed to lose a promising student. Her mother worried about the dangers of military aviation, particularly given the increasing tempo of combat operations around the world. Even her father, despite his deep respect for the pilots he had served with, expressed concerns about the physical and mental demands of flight training. But Jessica had found her calling. The more she learned about transport aviation, the more convinced she became that this was where she belonged. The combination of technical complexity, operational significance, and potential for humanitarian impact aligned perfectly with her desire to serve others while challenging herself intellectually and professionally. Initial flight training at Columbus Air Force Base in Mississippi had gone remarkably well. Jessica's systematic approach to learning and her exceptional attention to detail made her a standout student in ground school. She mastered aircraft systems, navigation procedures, and flight theory with the same methodical precision that had served her well in organic chemistry and anatomy classes. Her first solo flight had been a revelation. After months of studying aerodynamics in textbooks, actually feeling an aircraft respond to her control inputs was both thrilling and deeply satisfying. The T-6 Texan trainer was a far cry from the massive C-130 she hoped to eventually fly, but it provided her first taste of the responsibility and freedom that came with being pilot in command of a military aircraft. Flight instructors consistently praised Jessica's smooth, precise flying style. She approached each maneuver methodically, thinking through the physics involved rather than relying purely on intuition or muscle memory. This analytical approach served her particularly well during instrument flying training, where pilots must navigate and control aircraft using only cockpit gauges while ignoring potentially misleading sensory inputs. Her academic performance remained exceptional throughout initial flight training. She consistently scored in the top 5% on written examinations and demonstrated mastery of complex navigation and communication procedures. When graduation assignments were announced, Jessica was among the handful of students selected for advanced training in large aircraft, specifically the C-130 Hercules program. The transition from Columbus to Randolph Air Force Base represented a massive leap in complexity and expectation. Where initial flight training had focused on basic flying skills in relatively simple aircraft, C-130 training demanded mastery of systems that were exponentially more complicated, while operating in scenarios that closely mimicked real-world combat and humanitarian missions. The aircraft itself was intimidating. At nearly 100 feet long with a wingspan of 132 feet, the C-130 dwarfed any aircraft Jessica had previously flown. Its 4 turboprop engines generated over 17,000 horsepower, enough to lift 70,000 pounds of cargo to altitudes above 25,000 feet. The cockpit contained hundreds of switches, gauges, and control systems that required not just memorization but intuitive understanding. But size and complexity were only part of the challenge. C-130 operations demanded a fundamentally different mindset from the individual focus of single-engine training. Transport aircraft required seamless coordination between pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and loadmaster. 4 distinct specialties that had to function as a perfectly synchronized team. A pilot might be technically proficient in aircraft control but still fail as a C-130 aircraft commander if they couldn't effectively manage crew dynamics and mission planning. The operational environment added another layer of complexity. Unlike commercial airlines that operated from well-maintained airports with extensive ground support, C-130s regularly landed on dirt strips in remote locations, with minimal navigation aids and no emergency services. Pilots needed to assess runway conditions, calculate performance limitations with heavy cargo loads, and make go-no-go decisions that could affect entire military operations. Combat considerations permeated every aspect of training. C-130 pilots needed to master low-level flight techniques designed to avoid enemy radar and surface-to-air missiles. They practiced tactical approaches and departures that prioritized survival over passenger comfort. Night vision goggle operations required completely relearning basic flying skills in an environment where depth perception and spatial orientation became serious challenges. Weather flying represented yet another specialization. Transport missions often couldn't wait for ideal conditions, meaning C-130 pilots regularly operated in weather that would ground commercial flights. This required not just technical skill in instrument flying, but the judgment to distinguish between challenging but manageable conditions and genuinely dangerous situations that required mission cancellation. The humanitarian mission profile that had originally attracted Jessica to transport flying proved to be among the most demanding. Disaster relief operations typically involved flying into areas with damaged or non-existent navigation infrastructure, often carrying overweight cargo loads to improvised landing sites. Medical evacuation missions required precise timing and coordination with ground medical teams while maintaining the smooth, stable flight conditions necessary for treating critically injured patients. International operations added diplomatic and logistical complexities that civilian pilots never encountered. C-130 crews needed to understand foreign airspace procedures, coordinate with allied military forces, and navigate complex international regulations while maintaining operational security. Cultural sensitivity became as important as technical proficiency when operating in countries where American military presence was politically delicate. The training pipeline itself was designed to identify and eliminate pilots who couldn't handle these multifaceted demands. Unlike civilian flight training that focused primarily on skill development, military aviation training was essentially an extended evaluation process. Every flight, every examination, and every simulation was both a learning opportunity and a test of fitness for the enormous responsibilities that came with military pilot status. Washout rates reflected these demanding standards. Statistical analysis of previous training classes showed that approximately 40% of students would not complete the program successfully. Some would struggle with the technical complexity of aircraft systems. Others would demonstrate adequate flying skills but fail to develop the leadership and decision-making capabilities required for aircraft command positions. The most challenging eliminations involved students who possessed both technical competence and leadership potential but couldn't handle the psychological pressure of high-stakes decision-making. These pilots might perform adequately in routine training flights, but crumble during emergency procedures or complex tactical scenarios. Identifying these limitations early in training was crucial, since psychological breakdown in actual combat situations could have catastrophic consequences. Female pilots faced additional scrutiny and pressures that complicated an already challenging process. Despite official policies promoting gender equality, military aviation remained a predominantly male field where female pilots often felt they needed to prove themselves worthy of inclusion rather than simply demonstrating competence. Any sign of weakness or uncertainty was likely to be magnified and remembered longer than similar issues with male students. Physical demands, while less significant in modern aircraft than in previous generations, still presented unique challenges for female pilots. Long missions in turbulent conditions required sustained physical effort and endurance. Combat equipment, including survival gear and body armor, was typically designed for male body proportions and could create comfort and mobility issues that affected flying performance. Social dynamics within training squadrons could be particularly challenging. Female pilots needed to establish credibility and respect among male peers, while avoiding any appearance of seeking special treatment or consideration. This balancing act required constant attention to interpersonal relationships, in addition to the already overwhelming demands of technical training. The broader military culture added another layer of complexity. Success in flight training was just the first step in what would hopefully be a long military aviation career. Female pilots needed to demonstrate not only their ability to fly aircraft safely and effectively, but their potential to serve as leaders in operational squadrons where they might be responsible for male subordinates and crew members. These pressures were particularly acute in transport aviation, where crew coordination and leadership were as important as individual flying skills. Aircraft commanders were responsible for mission planning, crew management, and split-second decisions that could affect dozens or even hundreds of lives. The military needed to be confident that every pilot graduating from C-130 training possessed not only the technical skills to fly the aircraft, but the personal qualities necessary for command responsibility. As Jessica prepared for her first simulator evaluation, all of these factors weighed on her mind. She understood that she was entering the most challenging phase of her military career, where months of preparation would be tested against scenarios designed to push even experienced pilots to their breaking points. Success would open doors to a flying career that could span decades and take her around the world on missions of genuine importance. Failure would mean reassignment to a different career field and the end of her aviation dreams. The simulator building loomed ahead, its nondescript exterior concealing the sophisticated technology that would determine her future. Inside, instructors were preparing scenarios that would test every aspect of her training, looking for any sign that she wasn't ready for the enormous responsibilities that came with C-130 pilot qualification. Jessica took a deep breath and walked through the entrance, ready to prove that she belonged among the elite group of pilots trusted with the military's most critical transport missions. The simulator room at Randolph Air Force Base hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced technology. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens displaying real-time flight data, weather patterns, and system parameters that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. The centerpiece was the full-motion C-130 simulator itself, a massive white box suspended on hydraulic legs that could replicate the movement, sounds, and sensations of flying the actual aircraft. Jessica stood outside the briefing room, reviewing her checklist one final time. Around her, other cadets prepared for their own evaluations, some pacing nervously while others sat quietly, lost in mental rehearsals of emergency procedures. The atmosphere was tense but professional. Everyone understood that careers would be made or broken in the next few hours. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes emerged from the instructor's office, clipboard in hand. A veteran pilot with over 3,000 hours in C-130s, including combat missions in Afghanistan and Iraq, Hayes had earned a reputation as one of the most demanding but fair evaluators in the program. Her presence both reassured and intimidated students. She understood the aircraft and its limitations better than almost anyone, but her standards were uncompromisingly high. "Reynolds, you're up first," Hayes announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions in actual combat situations. "Today we're running Scenario 7. Multiple system failures during a humanitarian aid mission to a remote airfield in mountainous terrain. Weather conditions are marginal, and you'll be carrying a full load of medical supplies and personnel." Jessica nodded, trying to project confidence despite the knot forming in her stomach. Scenario 7 was notorious among cadets as one of the most challenging evaluations in the program. It typically began with routine flight operations before cascading into a series of emergencies that tested every aspect of pilot training. The scenario had a failure rate of nearly 60%, and even successful completions often involved significant mistakes that raised questions about a pilot's readiness for real-world operations. The briefing room was sterile and functional, with charts depicting the fictional mission area covering one wall. Jessica took her seat across from Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who opened a thick folder containing the mission parameters and evaluation criteria. The next 30 minutes would determine whether Jessica advanced in the program or faced the possibility of reassignment to a different military specialty. "Your mission today involves delivering critical medical supplies to a forward operating base in hostile territory," Hayes began, her tone businesslike but not unkind. "The destination airfield is at 8,500 feet elevation with a 6,000-foot gravel runway. Local weather includes scattered thunderstorms, moderate turbulence, and visibility restrictions due to blowing dust. Your aircraft is loaded with 35,000 pounds of cargo and carries a medical team of 12 personnel." Jessica absorbed the information methodically, already beginning to calculate the performance implications of high-altitude operations with a heavy cargo load. Mountain flying presented unique challenges even under ideal conditions. The thin air reduced engine performance and required longer takeoff and landing distances. Add marginal weather and an unfamiliar airfield, and the mission became exponentially more complex. "Your crew for this mission includes co-pilot Lieutenant Johnson, navigator Captain Williams, and loadmaster Technical Sergeant Martinez," Hayes continued. "All are experienced personnel, but remember, as aircraft commander, all final decisions rest with you. The simulator will replicate their responses and recommendations, but you maintain ultimate responsibility for crew coordination and flight safety." The weight of command responsibility struck Jessica with fresh intensity. In previous training flights, she had been a student learning procedures under instructor supervision. Today, she would be evaluated as a potential aircraft commander, someone trusted to make independent decisions that could affect the lives of everyone aboard the aircraft and the success of critical military missions. Hayes reviewed the standard emergency procedures that might be encountered during the evaluation. Engine failures, hydraulic system malfunctions, electrical problems, and communication equipment failures were all possibilities. The specific combination and timing of these emergencies would be determined by the scenario programming, designed to test Jessica's ability to prioritize threats, manage crew resources, and maintain aircraft control under increasingly difficult circumstances. Remember, Hayes emphasized, this is not just about flying the airplane. We're evaluating your decision-making process, crew management skills, and ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Don't get so focused on individual emergencies that you lose sight of the overall mission picture. Sometimes the best decision is to abort the mission rather than press ahead into increasingly dangerous conditions. Jessica acknowledged the guidance, but privately wondered how she would recognize that critical decision point when it arrived. The pressure to complete missions was enormous in military aviation, and the temptation to push beyond safe limitations in pursuit of mission success had led to numerous accidents throughout aviation history. Finding the right balance between acceptable risk and reckless endangerment required exactly the kind of judgment that could only be developed through experience. Experience that she, as a student pilot, necessarily lacked. The pre-flight phase of the simulation began routinely enough. Jessica methodically worked through the aircraft inspection checklist, identifying simulated maintenance issues that needed to be addressed before departure. The attention to detail required was exhausting. Hundreds of individual items had to be checked and verified, any one of which could cause mission failure or aircraft loss if overlooked. Crew coordination during the pre-flight phase revealed the complexity of C-130 operations. The pilot needed to coordinate with the loadmaster to ensure cargo was properly secured and weight distribution fell within acceptable limits. The navigator required detailed mission planning data to calculate fuel requirements, alternate airports, and routing that avoided known threats or weather hazards. The co-pilot served as both backup pilot and systems manager, monitoring aircraft status while assisting with communication and navigation tasks. Engine start procedures alone involved dozens of individual steps that had to be completed in precise sequence. Jessica found herself referring frequently to written checklists, despite having memorized these procedures during ground school training. The complexity was overwhelming, far beyond anything she had encountered in smaller training aircraft, where a single pilot could manage all systems independently. Taxi operations at the simulated departure airfield introduced additional challenges. The C-130's size and weight made ground handling completely different from smaller aircraft. Turning radius was limited, requiring careful planning to navigate taxiways and ramps without striking obstacles. The aircraft's high cockpit position provided excellent visibility ahead, but created blind spots that required constant attention and crew coordination to avoid collisions with ground equipment or personnel. As they approached the runway for departure, Jessica began to feel more confident. The systematic approach that had served her well throughout training seemed to be working effectively in the simulator environment. The aircraft systems were responding normally, crew coordination was smooth, and weather conditions, while challenging, appeared manageable for an experienced crew. The takeoff phase proceeded without incident. Jessica had calculated the required runway length for their heavy weight and high elevation conditions, confirming that they had adequate performance margins for safe departure. The 4 turboprop engines provided steady, reliable power as the massive aircraft gradually accelerated down the runway and lifted off into the simulated sky. Initial climb performance was slightly lower than optimal due to the thin air at high altitude, but well within normal parameters for the aircraft's capabilities. Jessica established the aircraft in a steady climb toward their cruising altitude while the navigator provided routing guidance toward the destination airfield. For the first 20 minutes of the simulation, everything proceeded exactly as briefed during ground school training. The first hint of trouble came as they approached their planned cruising altitude. The number 2 engine began showing slightly elevated oil temperature indications. Not immediately dangerous, but a sign that closer monitoring would be required. Jessica noted the anomaly and instructed the flight engineer to keep watch on the engine parameters while continuing the mission as planned. What Jessica didn't realize was that this minor indication was the opening move in a carefully orchestrated series of challenges designed to test her ability to manage cascading emergencies while maintaining mission focus. The scenario programmers had crafted a sequence of malfunctions that would individually be manageable but collectively would push her decision-making abilities to their absolute limits. The second indication appeared 15 minutes later. The aircraft's primary electrical generator began showing voltage fluctuations that suggested potential system failure. Again, not immediately critical, but another system requiring attention and monitoring. Jessica found herself dividing her attention between basic flight operations, crew coordination, navigation planning for the challenging approach ahead, and increasing system management demands. Weather conditions at the destination were deteriorating faster than forecasted. What had been scattered thunderstorms with moderate turbulence were developing into a more organized system with severe weather potential. The navigator recommended considering alternate airports that might have better conditions, but these alternatives would require significant additional fuel consumption and would delay delivery of the critical medical supplies. Jessica faced her first major command decision of the evaluation: press ahead toward the original destination and hope conditions improved, or divert to safer but less strategically important alternates. The decision required weighing mission importance against flight safety, exactly the kind of judgment call that separated competent pilots from true aircraft commanders. She chose to continue toward the destination while closely monitoring weather developments, keeping alternate options available if conditions became unacceptable. It was a reasonable decision that demonstrated both mission focus and appropriate risk management, but it committed the crew to operating in increasingly challenging conditions. The No. 2 engine oil temperature continued climbing throughout the flight, eventually reaching levels that required power reduction to prevent permanent damage. Operating with reduced power from one engine while carrying a heavy cargo load in mountainous terrain significantly reduced the aircraft's performance margins. What had been a routine mission was becoming a test of both pilot skill and aircraft limitations. As they approached the destination area, multiple problems converged simultaneously. The deteriorating weather had reduced visibility to minimums while creating severe turbulence that made precise aircraft control extremely difficult. The electrical system problems had cascaded into failures of several navigation and communication radios, limiting their ability to coordinate with ground personnel and receive updated weather information. Most critically, the No. 2 engine finally failed completely, requiring emergency shutdown procedures while the aircraft was already operating at the limits of its 3-engine performance capabilities. Jessica suddenly found herself attempting to execute a challenging approach to a remote mountain airfield with reduced power, degraded navigation equipment, severe weather conditions, and a cabin full of personnel depending on her judgment for their survival. This was the moment that separated pilots who could handle routine operations from those capable of managing true emergencies. Everything Jessica had learned during months of training was about to be tested in a compressed time frame that would reveal whether she possessed the combination of technical skill, crew leadership, and decision-making ability required for aircraft commander responsibilities. The simulator's motion system, activated as simulated turbulence, began buffeting the aircraft. Outside the cockpit windows, computer-generated imagery showed lowering clouds and rain squalls that reduced visibility to near zero. Engine noise changed dramatically as the failed power plant wound down, while warning lights and alarms demanded immediate attention throughout the cockpit. Jessica took a deep breath and began working through the emergency checklists, coordinating with her crew to manage the multiple failures while maintaining control of the aircraft and continuing toward their destination. The next 20 minutes would determine not only whether she passed this particular evaluation, but whether she had the fundamental qualities necessary for a successful career as a military transport pilot. The mountain peaks loomed ahead through the storm, their rocky summits hidden by clouds that contained both severe turbulence and the potential for aircraft-destroying encounters with terrain. Jessica had trained for this moment throughout her military career, but no amount of preparation could fully replicate the pressure of making life-and-death decisions when everything was going wrong simultaneously. The simulation ended abruptly with the harsh buzz of warning alarms and the mechanical voice announcing, quote, "Simulation terminated, aircraft destroyed." Jessica sat in the darkened cockpit for a moment, her hands still gripping the controls as the motion platform settled back to its neutral position. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the quiet hum of cooling fans and the distant sound of other simulators running in adjacent rooms. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes entered the simulator compartment, her expression unreadable as she made notes on her evaluation clipboard. Jessica climbed out of the pilot's seat on unsteady legs, knowing without being told that she had failed spectacularly. The controlled flight into terrain had occurred during the final approach phase, when the combination of reduced engine power, severe weather, and navigation equipment failures had overwhelmed her ability to maintain safe aircraft control. "Debrief room in 10 minutes," Hayes said simply, her voice neither harsh nor sympathetic. "Take some time to collect your thoughts." Jessica walked to the break area on shaking legs, replaying the final moments of the simulation in her mind. She had lost situational awareness during the approach, focusing so intently on managing the engine failure and electrical problems that she had failed to adequately monitor the aircraft's altitude relative to the mountainous terrain. By the time she realized the danger, there wasn't enough power available to climb clear of the peaks. The debrief session was clinical but devastating. Hayes methodically reviewed each phase of the flight, identifying multiple points where different decisions might have led to successful mission completion. The engine failure itself wasn't the primary problem. Experienced C-130 pilots regularly handled single-engine failures without difficulty. Jessica's critical error had been continuing the approach into deteriorating weather conditions when the aircraft's performance had been compromised by the power loss. "The hardest lesson for new pilots to learn," Hayes explained, "is when to say no to a mission. Your crew was carrying medical supplies, and you felt pressure to complete the delivery regardless of conditions. But getting everyone killed doesn't help anyone. Sometimes the most courageous decision is to turn around and try again another day." Jessica's second simulator evaluation 3 days later ended similarly. This time, the scenario involved a different set of failures, hydraulic system problems that made aircraft control increasingly difficult, combined with fuel system malfunctions that created uncertainty about remaining flight time. Again, Jessica became overwhelmed by the cascading emergencies and made critical errors that resulted in simulation termination. The pattern continued through her third, fourth, and fifth attempts. Each scenario tested different aspects of emergency management, but Jessica consistently struggled with the same fundamental issue. She couldn't effectively prioritize multiple simultaneous problems while maintaining overall mission awareness. Her technical knowledge was sound, and her individual emergency procedures were generally executed correctly, but she lacked the mental framework necessary to manage complex, dynamic situations. After her fifth failure, Jessica found herself sitting in Captain Rodriguez's office. As the C-130 Training Squadron's Assistant Director of Operations, Rodriguez had seen hundreds of students struggle with various aspects of the program. Some lacked the technical aptitude for complex aircraft systems. Others had difficulty with crew coordination or decision-making under pressure. Jessica's case was different. She clearly possessed the intellectual capability and technical skills, but something was preventing her from putting it all together when everything went wrong simultaneously. "I've reviewed your academic performance and flight training records," Rodriguez said, spreading Jessica's file across his desk. "Your knowledge of aircraft systems is exceptional. Your procedural compliance is nearly perfect. Your crew coordination skills are above average. But you're not passing simulator evaluations, and frankly, I'm not sure why." Jessica struggled to find words to explain her frustration. She had studied harder than anyone else in her class, spending evenings and weekends reviewing emergency procedures until she could recite them from memory. She understood the aircraft systems better than many students who were successfully completing their evaluations. Yet when multiple problems occurred simultaneously in the simulator, her mind seemed to freeze, unable to process the competing demands for attention and action. "Maybe I'm just not cut out for this," Jessica admitted, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger with each failed evaluation. "Maybe I should request reassignment to a different aircraft type or career field." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying Jessica with the analytical gaze of someone who had made similar assessments countless times throughout his career. "Before you make that decision, I want you to consider something. Your failures in the simulator aren't random. They follow a specific pattern. You're trying to solve every problem individually instead of managing them as part of an integrated system. You're fighting the aircraft instead of working with it." He pulled out a thick manual from his bookshelf, a compilation of actual C-130 emergency landing case studies from real-world operations. "I want you to read these over the next week. Don't focus on the technical details of what went wrong. Instead, pay attention to how successful crews manage their decision-making process during complex emergencies. Notice how they prioritized immediate threats versus longer-term concerns." The case studies made for sobering reading. Jessica found herself absorbed in accounts of C-130 crews who had faced situations far more challenging than anything she had encountered in simulator training. Aircraft that had lost multiple engines over hostile territory and managed to reach friendly airfields. crews who had executed emergency landings on improvised runways with severely damaged aircraft, medical evacuation missions that had continued despite equipment failures and adverse weather conditions. What struck Jessica most powerfully was how these successful crews had approached complex emergencies. Rather than trying to solve every problem immediately, they had focused first on maintaining basic aircraft control and crew coordination. Secondary problems were managed systematically, but never at the expense of fundamental flight safety. Most importantly, successful crews had maintained constant awareness of their overall situation and options, even while dealing with specific system failures. One case study particularly resonated with her experience. A C-130 crew flying a humanitarian mission in Africa had faced multiple system failures, similar to those in her simulator evaluations. The aircraft had lost an engine, experienced electrical problems, and encountered severe weather while attempting to deliver medical supplies to a remote airfield. The crew had successfully completed the mission by focusing on the essentials: maintaining aircraft control, preserving crew coordination, and keeping alternate options available throughout the flight. The key insight was that the crew had not tried to fix every problem. Instead, they had identified which systems were absolutely critical for flight safety and which could be managed or worked around. By accepting that some problems couldn't be immediately resolved, they had preserved their mental capacity for the decisions that truly mattered. Jessica began applying this philosophy during her next week of simulator training. Rather than attempting to restore every failed system to normal operation, she started focusing on maintaining basic aircraft control while systematically working through problems in order of immediate importance. The approach felt counterintuitive at first. Her instinct was to fix everything as quickly as possible, but she gradually began to see improvements in her performance. Her sixth simulator evaluation showed modest progress. She still failed to complete the mission successfully, but her decision-making process was more organized and she maintained better situational awareness throughout the flight. Most importantly, she avoided the controlled flight into terrain that had characterized her earlier attempts. Rodriguez arranged for Jessica to spend time with experienced C-130 pilots in the base's operational squadron. Rather than focusing on emergency procedures, these sessions emphasized the mental frameworks that veteran pilots used to manage complex situations. She learned about cognitive tools, like the threat and error management model, that helped pilots identify and prioritize risks before they became unmanageable emergencies. Master Sergeant Thompson, a loadmaster with over 2,000 hours of combat flight time, provided particularly valuable insights into crew resource management. New pilots often think they have to make every decision themselves, he explained during one of their sessions. But the crew is there to help you process information and identify problems. Use us. We see things you might miss when you're focused on flying the airplane. Jessica began practicing a different approach to crew coordination during her simulator sessions. Instead of viewing the co-pilot, navigator, and loadmaster as subordinates who simply executed her decisions, she started treating them as partners in a collaborative problem-solving process. This shift in perspective proved transformative. Crew members could help identify problems early, suggest solutions, and monitor systems while she focused on overall aircraft management. Her seventh simulator evaluation showed dramatic improvement. Although she still didn't complete the mission perfectly, her systematic approach to emergency management and improved crew coordination allowed her to maintain aircraft control throughout a complex sequence of failures. More importantly, she demonstrated the kind of command presence and decision-making ability that suggested real potential for aircraft commander responsibilities. The breakthrough came during her eighth evaluation. The scenario involved a medical evacuation mission, with multiple casualties requiring immediate transport to a major medical facility. As usual, the simulation included cascading system failures designed to test her emergency management skills. But this time, Jessica approached the problems differently. When the first engine failure occurred, she immediately established the aircraft in a stable configuration and assigned specific monitoring responsibilities to each crew member. Rather than immediately attempting to diagnose and repair the problem, she focused first on ensuring that the aircraft remained controllable and that all crew members understood their roles in managing the emergency. As additional problems developed, electrical failures that affected navigation equipment and communication radios, Jessica systematically evaluated each issue's impact on flight safety versus mission completion. Some problems required immediate attention and action. Others could be monitored and managed without compromising overall aircraft safety. Most critically, when weather conditions at the destination deteriorated beyond safe limits, Jessica made the difficult decision to divert to an alternate airfield. The choice meant delaying critical medical care for the simulated casualties, but it preserved the lives of everyone aboard the aircraft while still allowing mission completion under safer conditions. The simulation ended successfully with a safe landing at the alternate airfield. As Jessica climbed out of the simulator, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went beyond simply passing an evaluation. She had finally understood how to manage the complex, dynamic challenges that defined real-world military aviation operations. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes' debrief was brief but positive. "That's the kind of decision-making and crew management we need to see from aircraft commanders," she said. "You prioritized correctly, maintained situational awareness, and made the hard choices necessary to ensure mission success without compromising safety." Jessica's remaining simulator evaluations continued to show steady improvement. She began developing the intuitive understanding of aircraft systems and emergency procedures that separated competent pilots from true professionals. More importantly, she gained confidence in her ability to manage complex situations and lead crews under pressure. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. It had required fundamental changes in how she approached problem-solving and decision-making under stress. But the lessons learned during those difficult weeks of repeated failures had built the mental framework necessary for success in real-world operations, where the stakes would be infinitely higher than any simulation could replicate. 2 years had passed since Jessica's graduation from C-130 training. She now served as a co-pilot with the 317th Airlift Squadron at Dyess Air Force Base in Texas, accumulating flight hours and experience under the guidance of seasoned aircraft commanders. The transformation from struggling cadet to competent military pilot had been remarkable, though she still occasionally reflected on those difficult months at Randolph, when her aviation career had hung in the balance. The mission briefing on that Tuesday morning in March seemed routine enough. Captain James Morrison, the aircraft commander, outlined their assignment: transport 83 military personnel and their equipment from Dyess to McChord Air Force Base in Washington State. The passengers included members of a special operations unit rotating back from overseas deployment, along with support personnel and priority cargo that needed to reach the Pacific Northwest for onward movement to Korea. Weather conditions were favorable across their planned route, with clear skies and light winds forecast for both departure and arrival airports. The aircraft, tail number 74-1683, had recently completed major maintenance and was performing flawlessly during pre-flight inspections. Jessica methodically worked through her co-pilot duties, coordinating with the loadmaster to ensure proper weight and balance calculations while reviewing navigation charts and communication frequencies. The passengers began boarding at 0800 hours, a mix of battle-hardened veterans and younger soldiers, making what should have been a routine domestic flight. Many were looking forward to brief reunification with families before their next deployment cycle. Others planned to use the cross-country flight to catch up on sleep after months of irregular schedules in combat zones. Takeoff from Dyess proceeded normally at 0847 hours. The heavily loaded C-130 required most of the 13,500-foot runway to achieve flying speed, but performance was well within normal parameters for the aircraft's weight and atmospheric conditions. Jessica handled radio communications and monitored engine parameters while Captain Morrison flew the aircraft through its initial climb toward their cruising altitude of 23,000 feet. The first 2 hours of flight were uneventful. They crossed Texas and Oklahoma without incident, maintaining steady communication with air traffic control, while the passengers settled in for what everyone expected to be a 5-hour journey to Washington. Jessica used the time to practice navigation procedures and coordinate with flight-following agencies, building the experience base that would eventually qualify her for aircraft commander upgrade training. At 1,052 hours, everything changed in an instant. The explosion occurred without warning, a catastrophic failure of the No. 3 engine that sent metal fragments through the aircraft's right wing and fuselage. The C-130 lurched violently to the right, as asymmetric thrust from the failed engine overcame the flight controls. Warning lights illuminated throughout the cockpit, while the aircraft began an uncommanded roll that threatened to exceed its structural limitations. Captain Morrison fought to regain control as pieces of the destroyed engine continued to damage surrounding systems. Hydraulic fluid sprayed from severed lines, creating a slippery mess in the cargo compartment while filling the cabin with acrid smoke. The aircraft's electrical system fluctuated wildly as damaged wiring created short circuits throughout the airframe. "Engine fire, number 3! Morrison shouted over the chaos, his hands straining against control forces that were rapidly exceeding normal limits. "Execute engine fire checklist." Jessica's training took over as she began the emergency shutdown procedures for the failed engine. But as she reached for the fire suppression handle, a second explosion rocked the aircraft. The number 4 engine, located adjacent to the already destroyed number 3, had ingested debris from the initial failure and was now experiencing its own catastrophic breakdown. Within seconds, the C-130 had lost both engines on its right wing. The asymmetric thrust from the 2 remaining left-wing engines created control forces that exceeded the aircraft's design limitations. Morrison's physical strength alone wasn't sufficient to maintain level flight as the aircraft rolled increasingly steeply to the right. "I can't hold it!" Morrison yelled, his face contorted with effort as he fought the controls. "We're going to lose it!" The aircraft was now in a steep descending spiral, its airspeed building rapidly toward dangerous levels while the ground rose to meet them with terrifying speed. In the cargo compartment, passengers who had been peacefully reading or sleeping moments earlier now found themselves thrown against bulkheads and cargo netting as the aircraft gyrated wildly through the sky. At that moment, Jessica made a decision that would define the rest of her career. Rather than continuing as co-pilot, she took primary control of the aircraft. "I have the aircraft," she announced firmly, her hands joining Morrison's on the control yoke. Together, they began applying maximum left rudder and differential power from the remaining engines to counteract the violent rolling motion. Jessica's simulator training, all those hours of repeated failures and systematic problem-solving, suddenly became relevant in a way she had never imagined. The controlled crashes and frustrated debriefs had built neural pathways that now activated automatically under extreme stress. Her mind shifted into the analytical mode that had eventually led to simulator success, prioritizing immediate survival over comprehensive system restoration. "Load, get me a damage report from the cargo compartment," she called to Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, the loadmaster. "Flight engineer, I need power settings for 2-engine approach configuration. Navigator, find me the nearest suitable airport." While coordinating crew actions, Jessica worked with Morrison to establish the aircraft in a stable descent. The technique required precise coordination. Too much power from the left engines would cause an uncontrollable roll to the right, while insufficient power would result in inadequate lift to maintain flight. They had perhaps minutes to find the narrow performance envelope that would keep the aircraft airborne. The damage reports were devastating. Rodriguez reported multiple hull breaches in the cargo compartment, with at least 12 passengers requiring immediate medical attention from injuries sustained during the violent maneuvering. Electrical systems were failing throughout the aircraft, eliminating most navigation and communication equipment. Most critically, the hydraulic systems that powered the aircraft's primary flight controls were rapidly losing pressure. Navigator Captain Wilson identified McConnell Air Force Base in Kansas as their best option for an emergency landing. The military installation had long runways, comprehensive emergency response capabilities, and medical facilities that could handle multiple casualties. But reaching McConnell would require maintaining controlled flight for another 37 minutes, an eternity when flying an aircraft that was progressively losing its flight control authority. Jessica established the aircraft in a shallow descent toward McConnell while Morrison worked frantically to restore whatever systems remained functional. The manual flight controls, cables and pulleys that provided backup when hydraulic systems failed, were their only means of maintaining aircraft control. Flying the massive transport aircraft using manual controls required continuous physical effort that would exhaust even strong pilots within minutes. "We need to alternate control every 5 minutes," Jessica told Morrison. "Neither of us can maintain this level of effort for the entire approach." As they descended through 15,000 feet, the situation continued deteriorating. Fuel was leaking from damaged wing tanks, creating uncertainty about whether they had sufficient quantity to reach McConnell. The cargo compartment was filled with smoke from electrical fires that the crew couldn't fully extinguish. Most ominously, the manual flight controls were becoming increasingly difficult to operate as the aircraft's speed increased during the descent. At 12,000 feet, Jessica made another critical decision. Rather than attempting to maintain normal approach speeds, she would execute a high-speed emergency landing that would minimize the time spent in the most vulnerable phase of flight. The technique was extremely dangerous. Landing speeds would be far above normal limits, requiring precise touchdown point control and maximum braking effectiveness. But it offered their best chance of getting the aircraft on the ground before complete control authority was lost. McConnell's emergency response teams were already mobilizing as Jessica began the final approach. Fire trucks, ambulances, and specialized rescue equipment were positioned along the runway, while air traffic controllers cleared all other aircraft from the area. The tower controller's voice remained professionally calm as he provided wind information and runway conditions, though everyone understood that they were witnessing a potential catastrophe in real time. The final approach required every skill Jessica had developed during her aviation career. Manual flight controls demanded constant physical input to maintain runway alignment, while the asymmetric thrust from the remaining engines created continuous rolling moments that threatened to flip the aircraft inverted. Morrison called out airspeed and altitude while managing what remained of the aircraft's systems. At 200 feet above the ground, with the runway threshold rapidly approaching, Jessica committed to the landing. There would be no opportunity for a second attempt. The aircraft's deteriorating condition meant that this approach would either end in successful touchdown or complete loss of control. The lives of 83 people, including her own crew, depended on her ability to execute a nearly impossible emergency landing under conditions that exceeded every scenario she had ever trained for. The C-130 touched down hard on McConnell's runway 19, its landing gear absorbing impact forces far beyond design specifications. Jessica immediately deployed maximum braking, while Morrison shut down the remaining engines to reduce fire risk. The aircraft rolled down the runway, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, its damaged structure groaning under loads that threatened catastrophic failure even after touchdown. When the aircraft finally came to rest 4,800 feet down the runway, Jessica sat motionless for a moment, her hands still gripping the controls that had kept them airborne through the most challenging 37 minutes of her life. The silence in the cockpit was broken only by the sound of approaching emergency vehicles and the quiet recognition that everyone aboard had survived an emergency that should have been unsurvivable. Emergency vehicles surrounded the smoking C-130 within minutes of its touchdown at McConnell Air Force Base. Firefighters deployed foam across the aircraft's damaged right wing while paramedics rushed toward the cargo doors where passengers were beginning to evacuate. The scene was controlled chaos. Dozens of emergency responders working with practiced efficiency to ensure that Jessica's successful landing translated into successful rescue operations for everyone aboard. Inside the cockpit, Jessica remained at the controls for several more minutes, methodically completing post-landing procedures even though the aircraft would never fly again. Her hands moved automatically through the shutdown checklist while her mind processed what had just occurred. The flight engineer confirmed that all systems were secured and that there was no immediate fire danger, clearing the crew to evacuate through the cockpit escape hatches. As Jessica climbed down from the aircraft, she was struck by the sight of passengers streaming out of the cargo compartment under their own power. Many were injured, some seriously, but they were alive and conscious, walking away from what could easily have been a mass casualty disaster. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez emerged from the cargo door with the last of the passengers, giving Jessica a thumbs-up signal that indicated everyone had successfully evacuated. The immediate aftermath was a blur of medical evaluations, preliminary incident interviews, and administrative procedures that always followed major aviation accidents. Jessica found herself in the base hospital, being examined for injuries she hadn't realized she'd sustained during the violent maneuvering and emergency landing. Adrenaline had masked the physical toll of wrestling with manual flight controls for nearly 40 minutes, and she was surprised to discover bruised ribs and strained muscles throughout her arms and shoulders. Captain Morrison was in the adjacent examination room, receiving treatment for more severe injuries sustained during the initial explosions and subsequent control struggle. Despite his injuries, he had already begun providing detailed statements to accident investigators about the sequence of events and Jessica's critical role in saving the aircraft. His account would prove instrumental in the formal recognition that would follow. The preliminary damage assessment was staggering. The destroyed engines had caused structural damage throughout the aircraft's right wing and fuselage that would have led to complete breakup within minutes if the emergency landing hadn't been executed successfully. Multiple hydraulic lines had been severed, electrical systems had failed throughout the aircraft, and fuel leaks had created significant fire hazards during the approach and landing. More importantly, from Jessica's perspective, the passenger manifest confirmed that all 83 souls aboard had survived. 17 had sustained injuries requiring hospitalization, but none were life-threatening. Considering the severity of the mechanical failures and the violence of the initial emergency, the survival rate was nothing short of miraculous. Colonel Patricia Williams, McConnell's wing commander, visited Jessica in the hospital that evening. A seasoned pilot herself with combat experience in multiple theaters, Williams understood the magnitude of what had been accomplished during those critical minutes over Kansas airspace. "I've been flying military aircraft for 22 years, Williams said, pulling up a chair beside Jessica's hospital bed. "I've seen emergency landings under all kinds of conditions. What you did today, maintaining control of that aircraft with dual engine failure and multiple system malfunctions, that's the kind of flying that saves careers and builds legends." The formal accident investigation took 3 months to complete. A team of specialists from the Air Force Safety Center analyzed every aspect of the flight, from the initial engine failure through the emergency landing sequence. They interviewed crew members, passengers, and ground witnesses while conducting detailed forensic examination of the aircraft wreckage. The investigation's findings validated Jessica's decision-making throughout the emergency. Her choice to assume primary aircraft control when Captain Morrison reached his physical limits had been critical to maintaining flight stability. Her systematic approach to crew coordination and emergency management had maximized their chances of successful emergency landing. Most significantly, her decision to execute a high-speed approach rather than attempting conventional landing speeds had been the key factor in reaching the runway before complete loss of control authority. The accident report specifically noted that Jessica's performance during the emergency, quote, demonstrated exceptional airmanship, crew coordination, and decision-making under extreme stress conditions. It recommended her for formal recognition and suggested that her emergency management techniques be incorporated into future training programs for transport aircraft crews. While the investigation proceeded, Jessica returned to flying duties with a different aircraft and crew. The experience had changed her in fundamental ways that became apparent during routine training flights. Her situational awareness was heightened, her decision-making more confident, and her approach to crew management more authoritative. She had crossed an invisible threshold that separated pilots who had faced genuine life-or-death situations from those whose experience remained theoretical. 6 months after the emergency landing, Jessica received notification that she had been selected for early promotion to major and assignment as an aircraft commander. The accelerated advancement was unusual, but reflected recognition of the leadership and technical competence she had demonstrated during the crisis. More importantly to Jessica, it represented validation that her struggling early performance in simulator training hadn't defined her potential as a military aviator. The formal awards ceremony took place at Dyess Air Force Base, where Jessica's squadron was permanently stationed. The base theater was packed with military personnel, family members, and aviation enthusiasts who had come to witness recognition of one of the most dramatic emergency landings in recent Air Force history. General Robert Chen, commander of Air Mobility Command, personally presented Jessica with the Distinguished Flying Cross, the military's highest award for aerial achievement. The citation read in part, "Major Jessica Reynolds distinguished herself by extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as co-pilot of a C-130 aircraft during a catastrophic emergency. Major Reynolds' exceptional airmanship, crew coordination, and decision-making under extreme conditions directly resulted in the successful emergency landing of a severely damaged aircraft and the survival of 83 military personnel." But the ceremony also included recognition for the broader lessons learned from the incident. Jessica was invited to speak about the emergency management techniques that had proven successful, and her presentation became a template for revising training programs throughout Air Mobility Command. The most important lesson from this experience, Jessica told the assembled audience, is that successful emergency management isn't about being perfect under pressure. It's about having systematic approaches to problem-solving that work, even when everything is going wrong simultaneously. "The hours I spent failing in simulator training taught me how to prioritize threats and manage crew resources in ways that ultimately saved our lives." The impact of Jessica's emergency landing extended far beyond individual recognition. Flight training programs across the Air Force began incorporating her systematic approach to emergency management into their curricula. The concept of threat prioritization under stress became a formal component of crew resource management training, helping future pilots develop the mental frameworks necessary for handling complex emergencies. The technical aspects of the emergency landing also influenced aircraft design and maintenance procedures. The investigation revealed that the initial engine failure had resulted from a manufacturing defect that had gone undetected during routine inspections. Enhanced inspection protocols were implemented across the C-130 fleet to prevent similar failures, potentially preventing future accidents. Most significantly, Jessica's performance challenged traditional assumptions about pilot selection and training. Her initial struggles in simulator training had nearly resulted in her elimination from the program, yet she had ultimately demonstrated exceptional capabilities under real-world stress conditions. This paradox led to fundamental changes in how training programs evaluated student potential and identified candidates for advanced responsibilities. The story of Jessica's transformation from struggling cadet to heroic aircraft commander became part of Air Force culture, told and retold in pilot training schools across the country. But the narrative wasn't just about individual achievement. It represented broader themes about perseverance, systematic problem-solving, and the importance of learning from failure. Years later, as a lieutenant colonel commanding her own airlift squadron, Jessica continued to encounter young pilots facing similar challenges to those she had experienced during her own training. Her approach to mentoring reflected lessons learned during her own difficult journey through the training pipeline. "Failure isn't the end of your story," she would tell struggling students. "It's information about what you need to work on." Every pilot I know has faced moments when they questioned whether they belonged in aviation. The difference between those who succeed and those who don't isn't avoiding failure. It's learning from it and developing the systematic approaches that work when everything goes wrong. The aircraft involved in the emergency landing was eventually scrapped, its useful life ended by the extensive damage sustained during the engine failures and subsequent emergency landing. But components were preserved for display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where they serve as tangible reminders of the importance of pilot training, crew coordination, and systematic emergency management. The passenger manifest from that March flight became a who's who of military personnel who went on to distinguished careers in various fields. Many maintained contact with Jessica over the years, crediting her actions with enabling them to complete their military service and pursue post-military careers that might otherwise have been cut short. Several named daughters after her, ensuring that the story of her heroism would be passed to future generations. The broader impact on military aviation safety was measurable and significant. The enhanced training programs, inspired by Jessica's emergency management techniques, contributed to a marked reduction in accidents involving transport aircraft. The systematic approach to threat prioritization became standard throughout military aviation, influencing not just Air Force operations but Army, Navy, and Marine Corps flight training as well. Jessica's story also resonated beyond military aviation circles. Commercial airlines began incorporating elements of her emergency management philosophy into their own training programs, recognizing that the systematic approaches developed in military aviation could enhance safety in civilian operations as well. The transformation from failing cadet to heroic pilot exemplified broader themes about human potential and the importance of persistence in the face of setbacks. Educational institutions used Jessica's story to illustrate concepts about growth mindset, systematic problem-solving, and the value of learning from failure rather than being defeated by it. 20 years after the emergency landing, Jessica retired from the Air Force as a brigadier general, having commanded operations that spanned multiple continents and conflicts. Her career included combat deployments, humanitarian missions, and leadership positions that influenced aviation safety and training throughout the military. But she consistently identified the emergency landing over Kansas as the defining moment of her career, not because of the recognition it brought, but because it represented the culmination of years of struggle, learning, and systematic preparation that had finally been tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Why for? The lesson she carried forward was simple but profound. Success in high-stakes situations isn't about avoiding problems or being naturally gifted. It's about developing systematic approaches to problem-solving that function effectively, even when everything seems to be falling apart. Those approaches are built through practice, failure, analysis, and the willingness to keep trying when initial efforts don't succeed. Today, Jessica's story continues to inspire new generations of military aviators who face their own struggles with complex training programs and demanding operational requirements. Her example demonstrates that early difficulties don't predict ultimate potential, and that the most valuable lessons often come from the failures that seem most devastating at the time. The 83 lives saved during those critical minutes over Kansas represent more than just a successful emergency landing. They symbolize the potential that can be realized when systematic preparation meets unexpected opportunity, when years of struggle suddenly transform into the exact capabilities needed to save lives and accomplish the impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.